desde hace muchos años, y como bien me decía el señor Borrell, desde hace muchísimos años, desde 2000 más o menos, se había comprometido con una idea importante sobre un apoyo importante al europeísmo. Y el señor Borrell, el alto representante de la Unión para los Asuntos Exteriores y de Seguridad, ha sido el protagonista, ha tenido la deferencia de no solo dirigir, sino planificar y elaborar unos cursos que nos han permitido durante todos estos años dar una nueva visión de lo que debe ser la Unión Europea y su papel en las relaciones internacionales. He dicho antes que para nosotros era un verdadero honor, y lo es. He dicho antes que estos cursos son un puntal fundamental en el verano de la Universidad Menéndez Pelayo, y ahora quiero decir, si me lo permiten, y darle ya la palabra a las personas que aquí me acompañan y agradecer que estén aquí con nosotros, simplemente decir que para nosotros el poder ofrecer un curso de esta calidad, un curso con estos ponentes, es algo que es un sueño que intentamos cumplir todos los años y que en años anteriores por la pandemia no fue posible en la medida que hoy están ustedes aquí, pero que consideramos que en el futuro se pueda seguir celebrando. Por tanto, bienvenidos todos, muy agradecida por la presencia, en primer lugar, del señor Enrico Letta como presidente del Instituto Jacques Delors y como presidente del Consejo de Ministros italiano entre 2013 y 2014. Su presencia aquí es un verdadero honor. La verdad es que, tendría que felicitar al director del curso por esa posibilidad y esa agenda tan maravillosa que nos hace que, de verdad, estemos, como decía el señor Letta, hoy Santander sea la capital de Europa. Muchísimas gracias a los dos y el señor Letta tiene la palabra.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here. Sorry, not speaking in.
Muchísimas gracias. Es un placer aquí. Siento no poder hablar en español, ya que mi español no es lo suficientemente bueno y el gran riesgo es acabar hablando una especie de itañol y no verdadero español. Es un placer estar aquí. Es la tercera vez que estoy aquí. Se trata de un lugar fantástico y verdaderamente, como acaba de decir la vicerrectora, hoy Santander se convierte en capital del debate y la reflexión europea gracias al liderazgo de Josep Borrell. Muchísimas gracias por esto, Josep, porque aquí tenemos una mezcla entre acción y reflexión. Y creo que es fantástico el poder continuar reflexionando mientras actuamos. Sé que se trata de algo difícil, porque cuando yo estuve en el poder vi lo difícil que era intentar encontrar un momento para pensar mientras también a la vez tienes que actuar en cada día y cada minuto. Así que muchísimas gracias por tu liderazgo. También me gustaría decir algunas palabras sobre este tema. En primer lugar, decir que estuve aquí el año pasado de forma remota y la situación a nivel europeo era tan distinta de la situación a la que tenemos hoy en día. En primer lugar, nos enfrentamos a un momento en el que el éxito de la Unión Europea no solo tendrá que ser un éxito económico y de solidaridad, sino que también debería decir que la próxima generación de la Unión Europea será una herramienta para nuestra misión geopolítica. Next Generation se trata de una decisión tomada por la Unión Europea de estar juntos a la hora de reaccionar ante la pandemia. Esto no es algo que se daba por hecho, esto es lo que quiero decir. Me acuerdo de abril y mayo del año pasado. Estuvimos muy cerca del final de la Unión Europea tal y como la conocíamos. Me acuerdo del hecho de que Jacques Delors decidió hablar 8 años después de su anterior intervención. Ahora tiene 96 años de edad y en aquel momento habló para decir que estábamos cerca del final de la Unión Europea y nos encontrábamos a finales de marzo del año pasado. Y creo que tenía razón, porque me acuerdo muy bien y creo que tanto en España como en Italia éramos totalmente conscientes de cuál era el riesgo de ese fin de la Unión Europea, esa falta de solidaridad, esa competición para conseguir mascarillas y todas las herramientas sanitarias entre todos los países europeos. Así que la Unión Europea estaba cerca de su muerte, ya que resultaba tan difícil explicar cómo institucionalmente la Unión Europea no tenía ninguna competencia en cuanto a elementos de sanidad y así resultaba muy difícil reaccionar con un significado institucional cuando las personas están luchando por sus vidas. Esta es la razón por la que en ese preciso momento comprendimos lo difícil que era el discurso institucional, así como las acciones. Creo que la decisión tomada por la Unión Europea el año pasado y el liderazgo de la Comisión y de todos los países ha sido muy importante. Ahora mismo yo no tengo ninguna responsabilidad institucional en mi país. Soy líder de un partido, pero no soy, estoy en el gobierno. Por lo tanto, puedo decir que una de las razones por las que Josep Borrell también puede hablar igual que yo. Y creo que una de las decisiones que tomamos el año pasado, y esta decisión, además, que es una decisión a largo plazo, fue que se pudo tomar porque éramos 27 y no 28. Y realmente esto es algo que me entristece, la idea de que los británicos decidieron irse de la Unión Europea. Y digo honestamente que en ese caso hubiese sido imposible firmar Next Generation, próxima generación EU, con el primer ministro del Reino Unido en esa mesa con 28 países. Hubiese sido imposible tomar este tipo de decisiones sociales y solidarias y al mismo tiempo fortalecer la misión común de la Unión Europea. Creo que el Brexit ayudó a la Unión Europea a tomar estas decisiones del Future Generation EU. Además, el Brexit es una decisión que tiene que ver con muchos otros temas que luego están relacionados también con la Unión Europea en cuanto a temas geopolíticos y también otros aspectos. Pero lo que sí querría decir es que tomamos la decisión que tomamos el año pasado, después de marzo a julio, se tomó esta decisión de forma muy rápida porque estábamos más unidos. Y porque estos 4 grandes países de la Unión Europea, Alemania, Francia, España e Italia, fueron capaces de negociar, tomar una decisión y seguir adelante. Ahora pienso que la Comisión Geopolítica tiene más herramientas gracias a esta unidad y el proceso de próxima generación. Me gustaría decir algo sobre el futuro ahora. Next Generation es una gran oportunidad. Esta oportunidad necesita consecuencias, condiciones y toma de decisiones. En primer lugar, debemos actuar de forma muy rápida. Debemos implementar Next Generation EU y debemos hacerlo en primer lugar para países como España, Italia, Francia, Portugal, aquellos países más afectados por la pandemia, porque gran parte de Next Generation EU y sus recursos va para estos países. Y necesitamos mostrar lo serio que va a ser la implementación de todos estos recursos. Creo que se trata de una gran responsabilidad sobre nuestros hombros, y cuando digo nuestros hablo de España e Italia en primer lugar, porque España e Italia suponen un 40% de este cheque europeo. Luego hay un segundo elemento que quiero destacar que tiene que ver con el hecho de que Next Generation EU se trata de una herramienta fantástica que dará a nuestros países las posibilidades de superar la crisis y de tener una recuperación adecuada con ese enlace entre la justicia social y la sostenibilidad. Esto creo que es otro de los grandes logros del periodo en el que has estado en la comisión, Josep, donde tomasteis la decisión adecuada de evitar la posibilidad de escoger una recuperación de cualquier forma. Hubiese sido posible tomar esta decisión, recuperación de cualquier modo, pero puede acabar siendo una recuperación del carbono, por ejemplo, pero nosotros decidimos hablar de recuperación junto con sostenibilidad, que creo que es una decisión correcta, porque ahora tenemos la posibilidad de pasar a una misión de recuperación y logro de la sostenibilidad ecológica y justicia social. Pero además hay un tercer punto que quizás para mí sea el más importante hoy en día. Creo que también debemos hablar de las misiones para el futuro, los retos para el futuro y los problemas a los que nos enfrentamos. El gran problema de Next Generation EU, Josep, es que de hecho, debido a la emergencia, se decidió dar dinero a los países, a los Estados miembros. Y Next Generation EU son 750.000 millones de euros divididos entre los Estados miembros. No hay un proyecto europeo para este presupuesto, sino que son proyectos nacionales los que se desarrollarán, que creo que es correcto, porque creo que nos encontrábamos en ese momento de dificultad y que teníamos esa necesidad de una recuperación inmediata. Pero centrándonos en lo que vamos a debatir hoy aquí en la WIMP en Santander, para mí el punto clave es cómo estar al nivel de China y Estados Unidos en competitividad para el futuro. Podemos estar únicamente a su nivel si desarrollamos proyectos europeos, con proyectos europeos digitales, proyectos de desarrollo sostenible europeo, proyectos industriales europeos. Así que lo que quiero decir con esto es que necesitamos dar un paso más para el futuro de Next Generation EU. Y este paso significa la necesidad de que todos nosotros comprendamos ese proyectos transnacionales y transfronterizos que serán el futuro de la Unión Europea si queremos ser verdaderamente competitivos como Estados Unidos y China, porque para ellos sus proyectos, los proyectos chinos y los proyectos americanos, no son un proyecto de Texas o de Minnesota, sino que son un proyecto americano. Y los proyectos chinos lo mismo, son proyectos chinos. Nosotros tenemos proyectos que a veces son demasiado un proyecto italiano o un proyecto alemán o francés o español. Así que creo que el siguiente paso es trabajar juntos en este aspecto. Y para hacerlo creo que es absolutamente necesario invertir muy bien este dinero y convencer al resto de países europeos para tener ese segundo paso de Next Generation EU para el futuro, una continuidad del proyecto basándose en proyectos europeos. También me gustaría destacar aquellos aspectos que tienen que ver con el hecho de que hoy en día todas nuestras gente, nuestros ciudadanos viven en un momento en el que el presupuesto y el dinero europeo no está únicamente limitado al presupuesto habitual. El presupuesto habitual es bastante bajo si pensamos lo que tenemos hoy en día. Hoy, el hecho de que tengamos dos presupuestos, el habitual más el de Next Generation EU, nos está dando la posibilidad de proporcionar respuestas a las necesidades de los ciudadanos en distintos países, en temas sociales, digitales, de transición ecológica. Pero se pueden imaginar volver al presupuesto anterior habitual de la Unión Europea. Creo que sería imposible dar ese paso atrás y trabajar como se había hecho hasta entonces. Ese presupuesto en el que cada diciembre debatíamos y luchábamos por tener 1.000 millones más para el proyecto Erasmus o para las actividades de investigación. Creo que sería imposible volver atrás hoy en día, y la necesidad de nuestros ciudadanos de ser capaces de tener todas estas herramientas creo que significa y nos lleva a estar unidos y trabajar con determinación en este aspecto. Y me gustaría decir unas últimas palabras, Josep. Creo que lo que he dicho está relacionado directamente con todas las competencias y las misiones que Josep está intentando elevar a nivel europeo en cuanto a la Comisión Geopolítica, mayor unificación a nivel europeo. Y como decía, lo último que quería comentar es este punto, este elemento que tiene que ver con lo que está ocurriendo hoy en día. Nos enfrentamos a una nueva fase de la pandemia y creo que debemos aprender de las elecciones y de lo que ha ocurrido en los últimos 16 meses. Debemos ser muy buenos a la hora de coordinarnos a nivel europeo en respuesta a esta nueva fase del reto de la pandemia. Debemos evitar trabajar en actividades separadas, en silos. Debemos dar a la Comisión Europea la posibilidad de coordinar todas las medidas. Creo que la reacción a, por ejemplo, la actitud de Novax, las herramientas para asegurar la posibilidad de toda nuestra investigación económica, de nuestros estudiantes durante esta nueva fase del reto de la pandemia va a ser absolutamente necesaria, ya que hoy en día hay un alto nivel de expectativas de nuestros ciudadanos. Tienen grandes expectativas para la Unión Europea y debido a estas altas expectativas nosotros debemos tener una respuesta y una reacción apropiada. Creo que debería ser necesario porque nos encontramos en un momento muy positivo para la imagen europea y el sueño europeo. El Eurobarómetro dice que nuestros ciudadanos en países como Italia, España, Francia y otros países están dando su apoyo a la idea de Europa y a la Unión Europea. Así que debemos tener un momento para reflexionar sobre esto y por eso creo que este momentum es muy importante para lanzar esos nuevos proyectos como Fit for 55, este proyecto para la sostenibilidad, que es muy importante para el liderazgo europeo a nivel mundial, y también todos esos proyectos de los que hablará Josep, ciberseguridad, por ejemplo, independencia a nivel europeo, proyectos digitales y capacidad de la Unión Europea para ser más fuerte y robusta en este mundo de inestabilidades. Lo dejo aquí, pero realmente creo que nos encontramos en un periodo en el que debemos aprovechar ese momentum que tenemos en Europa. Existe una actitud positiva por parte de nuestros ciudadanos y nosotros debemos hacer las cosas muy bien para poder conseguir efectos positivos, implementar nuevas misiones y llevarlas a buen puerto. Muchísimas gracias.
Bien, después de estas interesantísimas palabras que nos reflexión, tiene la palabra el señor don José Borrell, alto representante de la Unión para Asuntos Exteriores y Política de Seguridad, vicepresidente de la Comisión Europea y director de este seminario. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Esta sesión tiene tres protagonistas de excepcional calidad. El profesor Enrico Letta, la profesora Natalie Tocci, que veo está en pantalla. Buenos días, Natalie. ¿Me oyes? Bien. Y el profesor Marc Leonard, que supongo que también tiene que estar en pantalla. A quien sí veo en pantalla es al director para España del European Council for Foreign Relations, Ignacio Torreblanca. Nacho, ¿estás ahí? ¿Nos oyes?
Hola, ¿me podéis escuchar?
Lamentamos que no estés aquí.
Sí, voy a sustituir al...
Dime.
Voy a sustituir al profesor, al Marc Leonard, ya que por un acontecimiento familiar grave no puede estar aquí hoy con nosotros. Así que estaré yo en su lugar y, como ya sabéis, tampoco puedo estar yo allí porque tengo que estar aquí en Madrid confinado. Así que estaré yo con vosotros. ¿Tenemos algún problema, Natalie y yo, con la traducción, que solo se escucha en un canal o en otro? No sé si Natalie ahora me escuchas bien, Natalie.
Ahora te escucho en español, así que ahora parece que funciona. Vamos a ver.
Vale. Pues bueno, vamos a ver si podemos escuchar al alto representante en español o en inglés, el uno de los dos, pero estamos experimentando alguna dificultad.
¿Todo el mundo oye bien
El micrófono del alto representante está apagado, por lo tanto solo escuchamos su traducción en inglés. Deberíamos activar su micrófono.
Pues no pensaba yo que fuerais a escucharme traducido en inglés. Bueno, vamos a ver. Entonces, tenemos al codirector del curso de baja por virus. Pues menos mal que lo han detectado antes de que vinieras.
No escuchamos.
Porque si no estaríamos todos confinados. Y también tenemos una baja del profesor Marc Leonard, al que tú vas a sustituir. Bien, pues con esto, adaptación del programa, ya que ha empezado el profesor Letta a hacer su presentación, le voy a dar la palabra a Natalie para que haga la suya y luego podemos entrar en algún diálogo entre nosotros. Natalie Tocci, como he dicho antes en la rueda de prensa, pero ustedes no lo estaban escuchando, es la directora del Instituto Italiano de Relaciones Internacionales y asesora del High Representative y próximamente, por lo que tengo entendido, profesora en Harvard. De manera que, Natalie, cuéntanos cómo lo ves tú.
Okay, so can everyone hear me?
Bien, ¿me escucha todo el mundo? Bien, perfecto. Voy a comenzar con cómo la pandemia nos ha afectado y cómo ha afectado al proyecto europeo. Y realmente quiero empezar con cómo ha ido la pandemia y cómo, como europeos y como Unión Europea, hemos podido redescubrirnos de nuevo. En muchos aspectos habíamos perdido nuestra alma en las últimas década y media, debido a la crisis financiera y con la crisis europea y además también la llamada crisis de migración. Y básicamente habíamos perdido esa magia que está en el centro de la Unión Europea, que es la solidaridad. Por supuesto, con esta pandemia hemos visto que tenemos una gran apreciación de lo que hay en Europea y que parecía que estábamos al final de ese proyecto europeo, pero nos hemos de alguna forma redescubierto.
El año pasado, aunque se produjeron diferentes momentos y quizás diferencias entre los Estados miembros, pero existe un consenso que como europeos somos una comunidad unida, que enfrentamos esta crisis juntos, intentamos ayudarnos, aunque a veces no estamos siempre de acuerdo, pero que no compartimos tampoco los mismos valores, pero sin embargo existe este sentido de que somos una comunidad, a pesar de todo eso. Así que creo que hay un gran sentido de solidaridad. Otra buena noticia, y es que hemos, vamos a decir, redescubierto el método, es decir, el método llamado de la integración europea, y el sentido y la idea de cuando sea un proceso externo o interno, esta crisis se transforma en un deber, y de hecho la historia de Next Generation EU es esa historia. Es decir, que no sabemos si realmente podremos llegar a una integración amplia. Esto dependerá, por supuesto, de cómo se gastan los fondos, pero realmente esto representa una oportunidad para sacar de la balda y sacarle el polvo el método de integración que desde siempre había marcado la trayectoria desde el inicio. Es decir, que si se utiliza bien estos fondos de la próxima generación, tendremos la oportunidad de retomar esta agenda, la integración, y transformarla no ya en un único momento de un periodo, sino en un proceso continuo, que de eso es lo que se trata la integración europea. La tercera buena noticia es el hecho de que como europeos hemos vuelto a descubrir la narrativa como continente. Hemos perdido la narrativa de una Europa como una oportunidad, como oportunidad económica, que además se hundió con la crisis de la eurozona. Y durante el último año y medio hemos redescubierto una digital y tenemos muchísimos billones de personas que conversan en digital. Podemos decir que esta Next Generation va a dar un nuevo sentido de solidaridad y probablemente nos permitirá dar paso a la integración europea. Pero, volviendo al tema de esta mañana, ¿cuál es la otra gran ambición de esta comisión? Es la de hacer que Europa se convierta en una unión geopolítica, en una comisión geopolítica. La verdad es que no conozco mucho el sentido de la palabra geopolítico. Con eso yo creo que quieren decir que la Unión Europea sea como una unión global, mundial. ¿Y qué ocurrirá con este nuevo paisaje? Empezaré también en este caso con buenas noticias. Las buenas noticias es que antes de esta crisis imperaba un sentido que era que la Unión Europea estaba desarrollando una protección. Si pensamos en la autonomía estratégica, se trata de desarrollar una agenda de la protección. Pero cuando llegamos a la definición del riesgo, cuando abordamos la seguridad y la defensa, la verdad es que no hemos avanzado mucho. Con toda franqueza, tengo que decir que es un proyecto que nos llevará años, décadas, y realmente no sé si llegaremos a esta unidad en la defensa y seguridad. Pero lo que podemos reconocer, y lo que nos ha permitido reconocer estos 2 últimos años, es que no se limita a la seguridad y a la defensa la agenda de la protección, sino que tiene en cuenta otras áreas que de manera amplia podríamos decir aquellos que tienen que ver con la política industrial, el clima, energía, comercio y, por supuesto, todo aquello que se refiere al desarrollo digital. Lo que hemos podido ver es el desarrollo de una agenda que apunta a proteger los intereses y los valores de los ciudadanos europeos. Esto es algo que va de mano de la afirmación de valores en el seno de la Unión Europea y también la posibilidad de reforzar el Estado de Derecho y reforzar esta agenda de la protección. No sé, porque quizás sea demasiado pronto hablar de lo que nos llevará a llegar a esta política de defensa, pero se están haciendo muchos esfuerzos con el Estado de Derecho, hasta los mecanismos del Tribunal de Justicia, también el acuerdo de transacciones con China. Todo esto se está moviendo y estamos retomando estas cuestiones en los últimos meses. Tampoco debemos olvidar la unión digital de mercado y todo lo que se está haciendo, y tampoco podemos olvidar esa línea que reúne a todas estas políticas, que es la idea de que la Unión Europea reconozca que tiene que proteger sus normas, sus leyes y sus intereses de manera más amplia. Al mismo tiempo lo está haciendo siendo consciente de que existe un riesgo en esta agenda de la protección, y el riesgo principal es que de la protección podemos deslizarnos al proteccionismo. Y cuando hablamos de la autonomía estratégica abierta, es que sabemos y somos conscientes de que estamos frente a un riesgo de proteccionismo y deslizarnos hacia ese proteccionismo. Y también se está haciendo un importante esfuerzo para tener en cuenta la dimensión local de la protección, de la agenda de la protección, en sus normas, y en la otra cara, es decir, el lado externo, todo eso, y se trata de reforzar el orden externo y el multilateralismo. Tenemos muchas cosas que aprender, no se trata de algo propio de la Unión Europea, sino que es algo que atañe a otros países. Tenemos que llegar a un método para poder reforzar el multilateralismo. Es decir, que lo que primero tenemos que hacer es establecer un consenso multilateral entre países con intereses similares, instituciones, y nosotros, por supuesto, nos hemos dado cuenta ahora que esto no es suficiente, que tenemos que llegar a un consenso con un grupo más amplio y un consenso flexible, pero también representativo. Y por último, tenemos que hacerlo de una manera más institucional o global. Tenemos que llegar a un consenso, por ejemplo, que sale de Cornualles, que va a pasar por Bruselas, que puede ir hasta Madeira, que puede ir hasta Nápoles, Venecia, y que por último este consenso tiene que llegar al que hablemos de clima, por ejemplo, en Glasgow, o de proteger a las multinacionales de la OCDE, o cuando hablamos del comercio o de las vacunas. Al final, todo tendrá que contar con iniciativas multilaterales que tendrán que llevarnos a entornos múltiples. Pero, por supuesto, existe un método muy interesante que ha ido emergiendo, que es el consenso entre un pequeño grupo que tiene las mismas ideas y después expandirlo a un entorno más amplio. y después llevarlo incluso a un entorno más amplio aún. Pero lo que yo siento como un gran escollo es que, bueno, por lo menos hasta ahora lo que he dicho ha sido positivo, aunque no sé si vamos a verlo, pero sí que se están moviendo las cosas, están ocurriendo cosas, pero donde podemos encontrarnos con escollos y dificultades varias, no es lo que yo definiría como la agenda de la protección, sino que lo que hemos visto durante los últimos años, desde más o menos 2014, ha sido el establecimiento de estrategia. Tenemos sus subestrategias, tenemos planes de acción, tenemos encajan con el mundo en el que estamos hoy. Voy a dejarlo aquí porque la verdad es que no tengo una respuesta a todas estas preguntas que nos planteamos. He estado intentando reflexionar e intentar ver por qué estamos avanzando en ciertos planos y aspectos en la integración europea, pero sí que nos quedamos atascados cuando llega el momento de hablar de seguridad.
Gracias, Natalia. Creo que hemos empezado la sesión de hoy de una manera un poco desarticulada y vamos a intentar reconducirlo a una cierta interactividad. Antes de dar la palabra al tercer miembro del panel, al profesor Torreblanca, voy a hacer un poco de contraponente y lanzar elementos de debate. Primero, Enrico creo que ha puesto de relieve algo sobre lo que hay que profundizar. El virus ha servido para demostrar una vez más que Europa se hace como respuesta a las crisis. Ya lo dijo, creo que fue el propio Monet, ¿no? Europa será lo que hagamos cada vez que nos enfrentemos a una crisis. Y sin duda hemos avanzado en la integración europea porque ha aparecido un virus que nos ha obligado a tomar medidas. Sin el virus no hubiésemos seguido discutiendo.
We would have been still talking endlessly of how we can just allocate the funds, get together funds, and we wouldn't have used these funds to give a certain number of.
Se han roto dos tabús. El tabú de que no se puede. No se oye muy bien. Que no ha salido muy bien. Que no se oye muy bien. ¿Se oye bien o no se oye bien?
Nosotros sí escuchamos bien.
Sí, pero lo importante son la sala. ¿Lo escucha bien? ¿Sí? Perdone, señora. Bueno, voy a seguir procurando que se nos oiga bien. Como digo, hemos empezado hoy de forma un poco desarticulada. Procuremos no desarticularnos más. Hemos roto tabús gracias a una crisis. En el ámbito internacional, probablemente tampoco avanzaremos en la integración, sino cuando tengamos que enfrentarnos a una crisis. Lo que pasa es que las crisis en el ámbito internacional son mucho más peligrosas que las crisis económicas. Esperemos que seamos capaces de avanzar en la integración para hacer frente a crisis internacionales. Pero las preguntas que ha dejado sobre la mesa Nathalie deberían ser objeto de debate ahora. ¿Y cómo lo hacemos? Es una pregunta que yo me formulo todos los días. ¿Y qué hacemos? La Unión Europea no es una potencia militar, ni pretende serlo. Pretende tener una política de seguridad, pero para protegerse, no para intervenir activamente en los conflictos. Y tiene razón en planteárselo, porque no está claro. Cuando la presidenta de la Comisión dice quiero que mi comisión sea geopolítica, ¿qué ha querido decir? Bueno, si nos vamos al diccionario, veremos que por geopolítica se entiende la rivalidad del poder sobre el territorio. Seguro que no quiso decir eso. De poder sobre los territorios. Afortunadamente, los europeos hemos tenido rivalidades por el territorio durante siglos. Seguramente lo que quiso decir es que hemos de tener muy en cuenta la dimensión externa de nuestra política, la dimensión externa de nuestro ser. Europa se construye para hacer la paz entre los europeos. Es un problema nosotros. Y eso se ha hecho. No tenemos rivalidades por el territorio dentro de Europa, con escasas excepciones en los Balcanes, que no forman parte todavía de la Unión Europea.
Asia and Latin America, it is a huge geopolitical issue. It is the aggravation of
Sí, hay que entenderlo. ¿Cuál es el papel de Europa en el mundo y de qué manera nuestras políticas se proyectan sobre los demás? Y Natalia ha planteado el tema de los valores y de los intereses. Las dos cosas cuentan, porque el tratado dice que los europeos van a desarrollar sus políticas en el mundo defendiendo sus valores y sus intereses. Cita los dos. Y a veces los valores entran en contraposición con los intereses. Y tú lo sabes muy bien. A veces los valores y los intereses chocan. ¿Y a quién das prioridad? ¿Qué es lo que defiendes primero? ¿Tu interés o los valores que dices tener? Y eso forma parte también de la definición de la Europa geopolítica. Porque quien tiene que ser geopolítico no es la Comisión. La Comisión sola no puede ser geopolítica, porque le falta capacidades militares. No tiene ni una cosa ni la otra.
Power, it has none of those, and the external politics are from the states. The European Commission has competencies in foreign affairs that are close.
Pero eso es una cosa y la política exterior es otra. Y tampoco tiene competencias militares, que siguen siendo competencia de los Estados miembros. Por lo tanto, lo que tiene que ser geopolítico no es el pilar comunitario solo, sino la Unión en su conjunto, si tiene la voluntad para serlo, porque capacidades tiene. Y por eso este curso debería intentar centrarse en cómo, después de una crisis que ha aumentado nuestra integración, porque la ha aumentado, sin duda, hoy hacemos más cosas juntos que ayer, esa es la integración, hacemos más cosas juntas hoy que ayer, y nos proponemos hacer más cosas juntos en materia sanitaria, porque hemos percibido que tiene que ser así, es bueno que sea así. Esa Europa más integrada, como transmite al resto del mundo sus capacidades. Y ahí tenemos el escenario, seguro al que hará referencia a Nacho, el escenario del siglo XXI es el escenario de la confrontación entre China y Estados Unidos. Eso es lo que marca este siglo. Y la gran cosa que ha ocurrido desde que nos vimos aquí el verano pasado es que ha cambiado la administración en Estados Unidos, hay un nuevo presidente. Y eso ha cambiado el escenario, completamente. Completamente. Esa confrontación seguirá así, porque no es un problema de los demócratas o de los republicanos, es un problema inevitable, inherente a la emergencia emergencia de China frente al poder de Estados Unidos.
That take globalization as state actors, and we cannot trust that the market is going to provide everything that we need in 24 hours, because we know there are geopolitical interests involved. We've seen vaccine nationalism and so on and so forth. So I believe that in the 5 axes of the strategic autonomy, which are health, climate change, economy, technology, and defense, in this interdependence knows what are the vulnerabilities and what we need to overcome. As you were saying, question about what is happening and what we're going to face in Europe in the next decade is that we assist to a transition of power between China and the US, which is significant historically, as Graham Allison Church of the 16 power transitions between superpowers in the world, 12 ended in wars and 4 were done in. So we're already in a technology Cold War between the US and China. This Cold War is going to be as technological as the previous one, because the previous Cold War always was fought technologically, which is the main front, but there is a fundamental difference between the first Cold War, because that first Cold War had to do with a lack of dependency. In that previous Cold War, they start, and the financial regimes of the Soviet Union and the Western world were not a part of something, and now we live in an environment in which we are much more similar to the previous independency, to the First World War. Great interdependency with many vulnerabilities and few institutions. Our world is more similar to the world of 1914, maybe in that sense, because of the excess of interdependency and the lack of institutions than to previous moments. But however, it is clear that these strategies that are being followed by China, and we look at the terms like fragmentation and deglobalization that we have in the dictionary. We are talking about technological spheres where it is going to be very difficult to have a role as Europe. It is difficult to have space in the world for a American pole, a Chinese one, and a European one, and therefore we have to think how we're going to play in this technological Cold War role, this Cold War that already exists. In the past, we've had the Brussels effect, through which, as Europeans, we thought that we could regulate American businesses. But remember that this Brussels effect happened while the Americans were not looking. They thought that technology was not a geopolitical problem. But now there is a big difference, because the report on artificial intelligence of the US government is done from the NSA, the National Security Agency, while in Europe AI strategies come from the ministries of economy. So clearly we have very different visions regarding this issue. One of the solutions for this issue, and something we are focusing on, is that the EU has to be capable of offering the rest of the world, the rest of countries, friends and neighbors, and it has to be able to work in agreement with the US. Here we have a great opportunity to reestablish multilateralism. We can deal with the issues of AI with ethical parameters and all the issues that have to do with the data privacy in the framework of the G7 and OECD. It has been done with the tax issue with the US, but we have to incorporate Latin America too. India, Pacific area, and all those countries that want to be part of this technological coalition based on values, like Natalie Totti said, that brings together these three ideas of values, financial profitability, but also security, because we live in a world of extreme cybernetic lack of security. I don't believe we will be able to resist much longer in this level of attacks and cyber attacks that is taking place, without going into issues as complex as dissuasion or offensive capacities of the member states of the EU that have a very low capacity. So I believe it is necessary to have this great coalition of democracies, at least in the technological sphere, because China, according to the last Carnegie report, exports control technology in a massive manner to no less than 60 countries. Therefore, there is a competition to technologically dominate and to technologically control public spaces and public spheres of many countries, and to implement these control systems. So I believe this is a very significant task in which Europe will be very present. I am an optimist regarding this European capacity. I believe it can be done. The same we can have seen in the economic field with the sanction mechanisms and the defense and reciprocity systems, but still there are many member states that are not aware or do not want to be aware of what is the power game, international power game in which they find themselves, where they can end up being completely irrelevant. And I believe the High Representative and the rest of the Commission have to lead in this issue. So even in the digital side of things, the pandemic has clearly shown what our vulnerabilities are, also for climate change. But I believe that both have to do with technology. One of the biggest risks, and I will finish with this, of the Next Generation EU program is that we end financing even more the Chinese technological technology in China. This happened with solar panels, and the same can happen with hydrogen batteries and so on and so forth. So if we are not at least autonomous technologically, we won't be able to, in the digital field, nor the climate change, nor others, be minimally autonomous. So if it's okay for you, I will finish here. We can continue with the discussion after this first intervention. Thank you, Natso. Well, you've, as well as Natalie, have risen many issues. We're going to see if there's interest of those here, the students following the course. Yes, you're right when you talk two things that I believe are really relevant. First of all, there cannot be any kind of autonomy if you don't have strategic autonomy and technological autonomy, technology is going to determine the capacities of any of the actors to become geopolitical. China stopped being a geopolitical actor when it lost the train of steam in the first industrial revolution, and it was left behind in history. But now the Chinese have learned from their mistakes, and they will not be left behind again in the next industrial revolutions. And Europe, that dominated this first industrial revolutions, nowadays we have to see if it really has the capacity to lead the technological transformations that are taking place. In some of them we've wasted too much time. I don't know if it will be definitive, but we're not at the same level in technological innovation on many aspects. And somehow we've lived from the what we achieved in the past. We were the standard setters because we were technology leaders at the time. But if we don't continue to be so, then we will lose the geopolitical standpoint. We speak about strategic autonomy and all these issues, and we should define that clearly. But the basic element is the capacity of maintaining technology leadership and not generating dependencies. The virus has also taught us what our dependencies are. Dependencies that we took as something that wouldn't hurt us, but now we see that we don't manufacture paracetamol, nor not 1 gram of something that we use every day, something that is not so important until we have an epidemic. We thought it wasn't important that everything was produced somewhere else. But when there is a crisis and everyone demands exactly the same thing, the supply chains collapse. So now we say to ourselves, we need to recover the autonomy, and we need to take into account what is happening with this kind of situations. Africa only produces 2% of the vaccines it needs, 2%. Obviously, you cannot trust only imports for more than 80% of vaccines that they need. The climate change would also be an important issue affecting this balance. We've decided we're going to apply a tax to carbon imports or to the assets according to their level of carbon. This is also going to change our geopolitical role, because those countries that are more affected by this duty will be Russia, China, and Turkey. It seems to be done on purpose. We've chosen the 3 we have the best relationships with. Well, no. It's because there's a mix of exports where they have a higher level of carbon. And then the 4th will be the UK, and it also seems to be done on purpose, even though it wasn't so. The relationships that will happen as a consequence of the fight against climate change have a geopolitical consequence, a very strong one, because wealthy countries have this energy mix, and they won't be so wealthy because this won't be part of our energy mix. And those countries that are poorer but have the means and the minerals that are necessary for carbon energy will become wealthier. So there will be a change in roles, in power and in wealth. But then there's the security dimension, understood as a military intervention in the world. And here we need to repeat once and again that the EU is not a military union. It is not a second NATO. It has the ambition of having its own military capacity. And when I say its own, I say it's different from NATO and different from the one that each of the member states has, because they each have their own military power. And France is a military power that has an atomic bomb. And there are other countries with similar military capacity. If we add all of them, we have more military power than the US. But obviously, we are nothing compared to the US. Curiously, the German Social Democrats go to these elections, and in their program, if I'm informed adequately, they talk about the creation of a European army. It would be the 28th Army, which would be a military army different to the one of the member states, different to just a cooperation of parties. but something that has its own entity and that will intervene whenever the EU decides they have to intervene. I really don't know how serious this proposal is, but these are elements that are being discussed. And let's not forget, the division is very big. Eastern countries don't see the problem of security in the same manner as Western or Southern countries in Europe. They feel an immediate threat of Russia, and they prefer to have NATO protecting them than anything else that we as Europeans can imagine. We don't have a same understanding of a threat. We don't feel threat in the same way. The U.S., the guy in Miami and in Alaska, they perceive in the same manner Russia as a threat, small or big, but it doesn't have to, it's not related to their proximity because Alaska is much closer than Miami, but it doesn't change anything in their political perception. But in Europe, someone living in Algarve or in Riga see things very differently. They feel the threat of Russia differently, as well as someone living in Southern Europe or in Northern Europe don't perceive migration in the same manner. Naturally, they don't, because they are affected by what they each have in their own countries. So how can we progress so that the EU is able to act in the field where we face problems? And you've given the example of Syria. Some European countries were starting to get ready to intervene as soon as Obama said that he was going to intervene. But once Obama said no, they weren't going to be present, then the Europeans decided not to do so either. Why? Because we cannot do it on our own, and when we've tried, the consequences haven't been very positive. And if tomorrow in the Balkans we were in the same situation that we had when the Yugoslavia disintegrated, would we be able to act on our own as we didn't do then? And we allow a second miniature World War 1 hour away flight from Rome, because we only intervened when the US and the NATO intervened. I have my doubts. Are we able to stabilize Libya? In Libya, we pay the price of our division. Member state has been supported, one of the sides, and another side. The result is that we will have Turkish and Russian military bases in the coast nearby, which is not something that is calming the situation, because now Turkey is going to dominate the migration route in this area as it does in the east. So what is the response capacity? Enrico has talked about unanimity. We can have a common foreign affairs policy based on unanimity that 27 member states agree, all of them at the same time. We would need a minimum understanding, a common ground. We should understand the world in the same manner, more or less. But if we don't, is it possible to believe that the 27 are going to agree on the same thing whenever there's a crisis? And the response up till now has been no, because we cannot have a common foreign affairs policy if we don't have a shared vision of the world, if we don't have this common denominators, and we don't face the world with the same cultural ideas. And these are the fruit of history, and history is very different for each and every one of us. It is clear that in Poland and in Spain we don't see the US in the same way, and I won't even talk about Russia. So that's why our discussion on the response to international crisis, even from the smallest, I say small, not saying that it was less important, but it was small compared to others, and that would be Libya. Let's not even talk about the conflict between Israel and Palestine, where there is a clear division between some countries and others. Can we eliminate unanimity? Can we? Yes, we could. But to do this, we need for all unanimously to decide not to work in unanimity, and that will be a veto right, to make sure that no one is going to do something that you don't want them to do. And very difficult for Europe then to be fully geopolitical. But I think it's time to give the floor to everyone in the room, those of you here and any those that are following from other places. How do we do this? Here I have some questions from the chat, so I can ask those questions, and I don't know if anyone in the room has a question. Please use the mic. Let's start giving the floor to those privileged that are in Santander. Anyone wants to say something? We're really sorry from the interpreting booth, but we get no sound from the room. I guess they're using a microphone, but the sound quality is really bad, so we cannot really interpret. So people that are hungry, that have nothing, they're given everything. And Europe doesn't have a duty you have to pay. Then it's not going to be only complex. We cannot compete with those people. Then we have the health crisis, where we've seen that some European countries did some things and others did something different. Or, for example, Spain bought something and another country took this product by negotiating behind our backs with China. Then we have the Moroccan crisis, this last one. An example, as a citizen, you can see the European project, and I could say it's full of sanctions, because in Morocco, Morocco is dealing with the U.S. to work on the sites that will be very important in 20 years for humanity, and some of are 800 meters from Lanzarote and 1.5 kilometers from Fuerteventura, and there is a threat there, because they say either you do this because they perceive the weakness of Spanish diplomacy, or we will do more things. So we see the weakness of the institutions, not absolutely all of them, but of some of the institutions when facing daily problems. So how could we solve this? Thank you. Well, let's try and have not so cosmic questions. The attack through Russia of Israel. If there is something I see in the Russia's president, is that it has really the look of a crazy man, of a madman. When he talks that we have to be respectful about the legal Russian system, and it is just working because of its opponents. We cannot respect someone who is not respecting the same values, human values. So I think that the European Union should give a stronger response facing these attacks. He is not going to stop his
behind the Baltic republics and behind Ukraine. So thank you. The Mr. Uribe Echeverria, a member of the Senate, has a question for Torreblanca. How do you see the European Union having a strategic independence in the technological and industrial sphere? I think you have mentioned that, but I think that Professor Leta has mentioned that. To do Europe and not the war. Talked about the issues of the Union. So we're doing something. It's just what he's mentioned. We are going to give the floor to Nacho. I think he's the one who will reply. And after Natalie, if she wants to add something. If both questions, we could just have them again for Natalie to understand. Could you repeat the two first questions? I can just give an answer to this last one. Okay. There is something which is essential when talking about strategic autonomy that is going to have an impact on all the spheres. It is the industrial politics, because we have set aside this kind of politics in the States, the Union, because we have been guided by a neoliberal attitude, so we thinking that the market was taking care of everything. We thought in the summit of Lisbon, I think it was in the 2010, I think, when we thought that the economy was going to act on its own without regulating it, just with good words and a goodwill and good regulations. But we have seen that many times in the United States, as in China, this doesn't work like that. So if we think, of course, we think that there are sectors that are strategic, but we have to invest on this sector. So that in this sense, Next Generation EU enables us to understand why we have to be present in certain sectors. But we mustn't forget the fact that this happened in the 80s. I think Natalie might recall, and you as well, in the 80s, the discussions before the Single European Act was about the fact that Japan was overcoming the European Union because they had the Ministry of Industry and Technology of Japan, and that had invested in political industries. So we tend to forget that if there are no active industrial actions taken, it is very difficult to get them from the markets. In the United States, I have just realized that the market can just take a part of this big pie, which is the improvement of the apps, but as they have on the other hand heavy expenses in military expenses, sometimes we tend to think that the United States is a paradise, but it's defense politics. It is also a way of defending the industry. It has also heavy consequences in the civil sphere. It is going to get in touch with the university, the capital, and is also moving many things. And that's what we have to realize as Europeans. We have to be more able to do these kind of things. Thank you. I
Natalie, is there anything you would like to add or comment?
The
making about perceptions and the differences in perceptions externally. I mean, I think, and I'm kind of convinced, as I think you are too, that, as you said, there will never be the same threat perceptions in Europe. I mean, simply geography and history and political and strategic cultures are what they are, and they cannot be changed. But I think that there is, sort of connecting to what Enrico was just saying, something that can be worked on politically when it comes to foreign policy. And it's precisely that sense of solidarity. I mean, it's precisely that sense of interdependence and appreciation of interdependence. So yes, I don't have the same threat perception about Russia sitting in Rome as I would do in Riga, but what I can work on politically is the sense that if I don't stand with you on Russia, you will not stand with me on Libya. And therefore, we will only be able to exit this together. I think that politically, in a sense, finding that spirit that has been found on the pandemic internally is what needs to be worked on externally. The second point that I wanted to raise is actually coming back to the example, Giuseppe, that you made of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, because I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is, to me, a really emblematic case of what we should mean when we talk about open strategic autonomy. So in a sense, if one thinks about it, we start with a mechanism in order to protect ourselves. Why do we need to protect ourselves? Because in this particular case, there is, as we know, the problem of carbon leakage, which is therefore not only preventing us from actually achieving our climate objectives, but is also harming our industry. So we go ahead, we will have hopefully a carbon border adjustment mechanism, but at the same time, there is a risk, and I think we're all aware of it, that carbon border adjustment mechanism becomes a form of protectionism. And not only does it become a form of protectionism, but it could also hurt a number of external countries. I'm obviously here not so much thinking about the Chinas and Russias and Turkeys of this world, but I'm thinking about a number of fragile countries, particularly in Africa. And therefore, what is the way for this form of strategic autonomy to be an open form of strategic autonomy is working on this multilaterally, and therefore trying to ensure that, because of course if we only have a nice carbon border adjustment mechanism and we're only responsible for 8% of CO2 emissions in the world, well, okay, fine, successful, but hardly successful in terms of achieving our global ambitions. And therefore, what the real aim of this is, I think, is that ensuring that from a European initiative, we really do get to a global initiative. Firstly, I would say working with the United States, and if there were to be a common carbon border adjustment mechanism transatlantically, at that point it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for China simply to ignore it. The third quick point that I wanted to make is connecting back to the reflections that were made about the current international system really reconfiguring as a conflict between political systems and ideologies. And indeed, I think it's absolutely right to say that in this and only this respect, it does hark back to the Cold War, which was also, of course, a conflict between political systems and political ideologies. And I think that Giuseppe, you're absolutely right. I think the main question here, and it was highlighted over the course of this pandemic, is what is the political system that can deliver best to citizens in dealing with a pandemic, in ensuring security, in assuring prosperity. And as we know, it's a marathon. And so I think in many respects, the agenda for strategic autonomy in Europe, which I think is exactly the same agenda when President Biden talks about a foreign policy for the middle class, is exactly about this. It is ensuring that, in our case, liberal democracies, and in our specific case, European integration, is a form of government, is a form of governance that delivers. So I think that, in a sense, this is basically the sort of main question which we're facing, which is why this issue of protection and autonomy has become such a salient political and strategic question now, as opposed to 5, 10, 15 years ago, when we didn't really have the sense of external powers trying to prove and impinge, in a sense, upon our own internal systems. Fourth quick point that I wanted to make is about unanimity. And of course, I agree with you. I mean, of course, it would be wonderful, but if we could go beyond it. But I think it's also important to bear in mind that it's not the only problem that we have when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, at times, and you yourself, of course, are testimony to this. Every month when you chair the Foreign Affairs Council meeting, we are very united on certain points. We're very united in agreeing not to do anything on a number of different conflicts, for instance. So at times, I see that, yes, at times the problem is one of division, but as many times the problem is the one of being united in our agreement not to take responsibility and not to take risks. And then very, very final point that I wanted to make is connecting back to the points that Enrico was making about populism, and I would agree with him that we have passed, for the time being, this is the point that I wanted to make, for the time being, we have fortunately tipped over into a political era in which there is, again, a value being ascribed to moderation, to competence, and of course, this kind of, really does, it is a trend that started in the United States, and we're beginning to see, let's see, what happens with the sort of forthcoming elections in Germany and France, so on. But, we're beginning to see the sort of signals of this in Europe too. But I think it's important to bear in mind that, of course, we don't have to, and we cannot afford to lower our guard. Because if one thinks about it, if one couples together the fourth industrial revolution with the climate revolution, meaning the transition revolution, these are two revolutions which, like all revolutions, have winners and losers, and that risk, if they're not governed well, to actually exacerbate inequalities, social, economic, geographic, generational, gender, I mean, you name it. And of course, we've seen it. We've seen this risk precisely over the course of this pandemic. So I think the good news is the fact that what I'm saying is not news. So we're aware of it. We're aware of the risk that there is going to be, the risks being a dramatic increase in inequalities. But I think it's important to bear in mind that the magnitude of the challenge is such that we cannot take it for granted that we're going to meet this challenge. And if we don't meet this challenge, and if the result of these two coupled and interlocking revolutions is that of a further exacerbation of inequalities, then I think the real risk is that we will see a new generation of nationalist populism that actually risks being even worse than what we have seen so far.
Sobre Rusia, bueno, en diplomacia conviene. Hay que hablar con todo el mundo. Ahora me toca a mí. Hay que hablar con todo el mundo. O sea, la función de las relaciones exteriores es intentar establecer vías de comunicación, incluso en los momentos más difíciles.
At a low point, But with Russia, we still need to maintain, and we've talked about this in the last European Council, a relationship based on three verbs: constraint, push back, and restrain. We're constrained. Before it was called contained, but now we say constrain, which is limiting or facing Russia when they have belligerent attitudes regarding what we're doing, like they've done regarding Ukraine. You need to push back. And at the same time, you need to engage. You need to have relationships because we need a common action to solve problems that we cannot solve without them. Like, for example, working in the Arctic, we cannot solve the Arctic problems without Russia, of course, being involved. Our Green Deal, our energy transformation will mean that we will purchase less and less Russian energy products like petrol and gas, and Russia will have to find other customers for its economy, because from the financial standpoint, Russia is quite small. The GDP of Russia is more or less the GDP of Italy. It's a bit bigger than the Spanish one, but so in economical terms, it is not a great power. It lives from the exploit of its natural resources. It has technology in the military field, but financially, it's not one of the big powers. And you will have to find other exits for their products, which are fundamental for their budget, because resources come from extracting and selling. If we purchase less, then others will have to purchase more. They will face a financial crisis, and these others can be no other than China. That's why Russia nowadays is getting closer to China and creating a very costly pipeline network to send to the east the gas that is being sent to us now. And this is also going to change the balance of its relationships. We are not interested in pushing them back towards a strategic alliance with China. We are not interested in another Cold War where, on the one hand, we have the association of the big autocratic powers, and on the other, the democracies. We need to find ways of understanding each other and cooperating. At what level? In the last European Council, there was a big discussion regarding if there should be a summit or not between European countries and Putin, or between Russia and European countries. France and Germany thought it should be adequate, and the others rejected it. And when France and Germany said, well, if President Biden just did this, he met Putin and had a meeting, why can't we do that too? Well, because for some countries, Biden can do so because the Atlantic is in between both countries, but for others, there's just a border between Russia and them, and this changes the perception of things, as I said before. And finally, it was decided that there wouldn't be a meeting now, but this doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk with Russia, overcoming the characteristics of each and every one. And this is not easy, because with the Crimea experience and with the growing and maintained tension in Ukraine, because in Ukraine every day people die in the front. On the 24th of August there will be a council in Ukraine where many people will be present to talk about the Crimea being in Ukraine and back again. But this is a border of tension, and you need to live according to that. But we shouldn't break relationships radically, nor stop links existing, because they allow dialogue, and in some cases we need it. It's not because we're nicer or less nicer, it's because we need it. Our energy dependency with Russia for some countries is very significant, and the industrial and financial relationship that some countries has is very significant, but not so much for others. And for others, there's no relationship, and the maintenance of the sanctions that were agreed against sanctions. For some countries like Spain, it's costly because Russia has established counter sanctions. They don't stop there. They respond. They respond when we've applied sanctions because of the events that have confronted us, and we put sanctions on different countries, and Russia and China responded with counter actions. So this will be a conflict relationship, but it cannot bring us to an isolation nor disconnection that is now impossible. It's impossible in financial terms and in political terms too. The other question, I don't know if you were able to hear it, had to do with how difficult it is to compete with China, and talked also about the weakness of our relationships with the Mediterranean. It talked about the Spanish case regarding Morocco and the migration actions used as tools when there was a difficult relationship. Right now, Lithuania is being object of an avalanche of migrants coming from Iraq and Afghanistan. They fly to Minsk, and from Minsk they are transported in buses to the border of Lithuania. So it is one way of pressuring your neighbor by using migration. Let's look to what's happening in the Greek islands. There was also an episode with Morocco, and now in the border between Lithuania and Belarus. So we need to know that this is going to happen more and more in the future. There is a great volume of people that want to come to Europe, and for some of them the vital horizon is to come to Europe because in their countries they don't have a future. And when they see us through the television, I understand the appeal of Europe, and they take many risks. They even risk their lives to be able to get here. And the transit countries like Turkey and Northern Africa, which is a transit area, also Eastern Europe, and for us as Spaniards, Latin America is also a continuous flow of migrants that integrate well, and because they fly here, we don't perceive it in the same manner as those that come in the boats. But human mobility is accelerating, and if Afghanistan is under the control of Taliban, imagine what is the migration that will be coming from Afghanistan. Therefore, Europeans more than ever would need to have as a first dimension of their role in the world the common migration policy that we don't have since Finland more than 20 years ago. And we don't have it because the position of the different countries are radically different in countries that don't want to accept migrants. They don't want to. Hungary is the clearest example. Maybe they need them or not, but they don't want to. And if they have demographic problems, they say that they will be able to solve them. But they don't want to mix with others. And there are other European countries that are the continuous mix, a permanent mix. We receive, we integrate high numbers of migrants. But because we also need them, Spain and Germany, if we didn't have the human contribution of the migratory flows, we would be condemned to a harsh aging process that would endanger the maintenance of the financial system and of social distribution. But this has to be an orderly process. It cannot just happen as a result of collective crisis. And that's something that we still don't have, but that we will continue to build. The Commission has made a proposal that is being discussed by the states with few possibilities of agreement right now, but this is one of the problems that we face, to create a policy before a human phenomenon that is becoming more significant, which is mobility. I don't want to alarm anyone, but imagine the demographic imbalance between Europe and Africa. When I was studying in primary school, they said that Africa had 500 million inhabitants. Now they're in 1,500. And in the next years, there will be 1 billion more Africans. So the imbalance, you don't need to describe it. Just by looking at the figures, you are aware. And there's a difference also in GDP. The demography changes, GDPs change. Or we either develop co-development mechanisms to help those countries develop, or we will have to face human mobility that European societies won't be able to develop. And this is not some of the things that we usually address, but I believe it's one of the most important things regarding the geopolitical role of Europe, and that is to get together to face the aging of population and the issue of human mobility to be able to compensate this. And the existential side of things is very significant. If we can't have a policy between 27, we have to find it between less of us. And it's very complex to have a common foreign policy or a non-common foreign policy when you don't have the internal borders. Because if you don't have these internal borders, then the external border of your neighbor becomes your external neighbor. So we cannot just focus on neighborhoods. Or we either rethink Schengen or our union. Because the internal union has an external projection, and you cannot limit it without questioning the inside union. Competing with China. Natalie, maybe there's something you want to add about competing with China. In some things it is obvious that we cannot compete with China, neither we want to, because we're very happy that China supplies low-cost products, which has been one of the things that has influenced more in containing inflation in exchange to manufacturing them. This is the international division of work, which is logic. But China is not a country that just wants to be a supplier of low-cost products and with low added value. Now China is at the peak of technology development, and it has a great capacity. It is big, and it's not only a big country, because there are other areas that are also big, but don't have the skills to develop technologically. The Chinese and the Koreans can do so because they've invested, and they've invested in training, in human skills, in capital. They want a future that is dominated clearly by technology, and we have to know if we want to compete with them or not. At least with low-cost products, it's something that was against our interests, so we decided not to do so. And Lionel Fontanier, an economist from Sciences Po, has a book that is called The Wage and the Expensive Shopping, more or less. That would be the translation of the title. And it explains how, regarding your shopping, the competition with emerging countries, and Chinese could be one prototype, is positive, because you import products that are cheap, and you go shopping, and you spend less by purchasing this imported product. But from the standpoint of your wages, the effect is not so positive, because you might lose your job because of delocalization, because now things are not produced in Europe but somewhere else. So these two sides of the coin is something that has been suffered by European societies, and this is also part of what brings us to populism, because many people that could buy cheaper products that are produced somewhere else, and now this means that these people have lost their jobs, so they're not getting any money because they don't have any jobs. So who's winning and who's losing? No doubt Big transformations, big structural transformations have happened in society, and there have been big losers and big winners. Part of the European society has won, but others have lost. Have we compensated the losers? Have the winners compensated the losers? No, they haven't. Probably not, or at least not enough. So this small social earthquake is what is now feeding this tendency to deglobalization, to reduce imports and international links. But are we going to go back in globalization? But we need to ask ourselves how we maintain this social balance so that there are not too many losers that lose too much, up to the point that we need to question the social model. And people like Trump and this kind of populisms are based on this. He told the American workers, I won't allow the industries to go away or to move away. I will have more taxes on imports and on this kind of movements of companies, and you will have more American jobs. And Trump didn't achieve this. But the Democrats also work or talk about this. They say America first. Not so much, but they say jump from America, which at the end of the day means the same thing. We believe in the benefits of trade, and we believe that China, by trading with us, would go through a process of development of the middle classes for the democratic freedoms, and that the economic growth and welfare would bring them to a demand of a political model that would be more similar to ours. But that hasn't happened either. It hasn't happened. The economic growth and the welfare of China hasn't brought with it a similar political model. In fact, it's just the opposite. There has been a harshening of the political group model. And this has had an effect on the relationship of China with the rest of the world. But we should be aware of this. It's not enough just to deny it. As you say, I don't know what you talked about when you were talking about minerals that are 800 meters from the Canary Islands. Then it's not a big problem because they're in the territorial waters, but sometimes they're in other areas where there can be more litigation. So as I said before, some countries that are very poor now will become much wealthier in the future because they have lithium and other minerals which are necessary to feed technology, and others whose resources will mean nothing in the future, because the prices of today, fossil fuels have a good price, but if we don't use them anymore, then they will be worth nothing. And this will affect these countries, and they will be left without being exploited, and they will be non-valued. This is not something that is being done with no resistance, and there will be future resistance. It makes sense. If I have a treasure at home and you suddenly say that it's not going to be worth anything, I will do something so that it is worth something. So transformations will not be free nor lacking tensions. But what is true is that Europe, with what it's recently passed, wants to lead again, as it was a leader in Kyoto when we were fighting against climate change and we imagined systems that never worked. Now we want to also work against climate change, but we are 9 or 8% of the world emissions after the UK has left the EU. Maybe tomorrow, imagine there's a miracle and we don't emit carbon. The problem will be exactly the same because there's still another 92% from the rest of the world. So our strategies need a geopolitical dimension. They need for others to follow what we want to achieve. If not, it will be worthless. And if we don't establish protection mechanisms in the borders, protecting yourself doesn't mean being a protectionist. There is a difference between protecting yourself and being a protectionist. You need to protect yourself without being a protectionist. The tax for carbon in borders is protectionist. Some might see it like that, but that's not the connotation. It is a protection instrument, because what you produce somewhere else, if you import it, then you have to compensate the carbon that you are importing. If not, I will just produce it here. The atmosphere doesn't care where CO2 comes from. We cannot delocalize without taking into account the impact on these structures. But this won't be something easy to do. You will see that when we try and apply it. But at least we looked at the problems in the face, and we've decided to establish this adjustment mechanism in the border. And this has a geopolitical dimension that is enormous, that we still are not fully aware of.
Natalie, do you want to add something?
Would add that, whereas, on top of what we've said, so this is basically a conflict between political systems, and it is, at the end of the day, as we were saying, what is the political system that can deliver most effectively and better, basically, to citizens, and that is, I think, a competition that we will not be able to escape, and it's a competition that will, at times, risk basically sort of spilling over into confrontation. Having said this, I think that there are two elements which distinguish the competition and even the confrontation with China that we, and obviously mainly the United States, but also we will, I think, basically be pursuing, and what existed during the Cold War. And I would really highlight two key mitigating factors. I mean, the first has already been mentioned over the course of the last couple of hours, and the word is interdependence. I mean, Nacho was kind of rightly putting the emphasis on the fact that we are sort of, moving towards an age of decoupling. But let's face it, there will never, and there shouldn't be a total decoupling between whether it's the US and Chinese economies or whether it's the European and Chinese economy. I mean, it is simply, going back to the balance, in a sense, between security and prosperity, and finding that the right balance. I mean, if we are to basically go all the way to one extreme towards security, basically saying any form of interdependence which can be weaponized generates a sense of insecurity, and so we have to chop it off, we have to cut it off, that would basically end up meaning exorbitantly high prices for pretty much anything that we want to buy. I mean, we can't simply sever global supply chains in that way. At the same time, there will be a rebalancing. And there will be a rebalancing, particularly when it comes to those global supply chains where we appreciate, in a sense, the security component. And security here, obviously, I mean it in a 360-degree way. So it's going to be a question of finding the right balance. But I say all this simply to highlight the fact that the balance still means that there will be an element of interdependence. And that is, in my personal view, it is a mitigating element of conflict. It's true that it means that disputes and disagreements can play out on many, many fields. It's about technology, it's about the economy, it's about information and disinformation, it's about security, it's about digital, it's about climate, it's about energy. But the fact that we are interdependent across all of these areas represents a mitigating element of conflict. I think a second mitigating element of conflict is that I think China, and I'm no China expert, but China, to the best of my understanding, as opposed to the Soviet Union, does not have an international project in the way in which the Soviet Union did. So it is fundamentally, I think, interested in preserving, in probably in the Chinese regime's own conception, protecting, to use a word that we've used a lot over the last couple of hours, its own regime. It's not particularly interested in ensuring that other countries around the world end up emulating its system of government. Just think about, for instance, the relationship between China and Ethiopia, to mention one example. So, okay, Ethiopia now obviously has gone down the sort of terrible road that it's on, but let's not forget the fact that in the past years, Ethiopia was basically considered as an example of a sub-Saharan African country that was on a path of reform. And of course, Abiy's Nobel Peace Prize, I mean, everything was going in this direction. Yet, in those years, although we were under the impression that Ethiopia was moving in a certain direction, China's relationship with Ethiopia did not suffer in any shape or form. In fact, the economic relationship between China and Ethiopia deepened significantly. So I simply raise this example to highlight the fact that I think, unlike the Cold War, where basically the Soviet Union was fundamentally about exporting a system of government, I think China does not have the same interest in the same way. And I think that is a second element that can temper the areas of confrontation between us and the United States on the one hand and China on the other. But I think, sort of as I said, and sort of summing it up, that, although there have been several scholars that I admire tremendously over the last few months that have been really highlighting the fact that, we have to avoid painting this as a confrontation between democracies and autocracies. And I think in principle, I would agree, we have to avoid doing it. But I think there is a degree of inevitability to this. I think it is basically the structural forces, in a sense, that are pushing us in this direction. And I think what we can do as Europeans is basically being guided by what I would define as principled pragmatism, i.e. knowing what our principles are, but knowing that in our way to pursue them, we also have to be pragmatic. But it is going to be a complex balancing act that I think we're going to be willing to go over the course of the century.
Creo que hemos sembrado bastante confusión en esta primera sesión.
I think we will have a lot of issues to address during the rest of the week. We have addressed different topics in a very spontaneous way with no much order, but I think it is great to do it like that. And I'm sure these issues will be analyzed in more details. I think we should finish now. We are finishing now at 20 past 12. We thank the interpreters for their work and their time. And when do we start again? Tomorrow? So this afternoon? I think there are conferences here, of course, but you won't be there until tomorrow. So your turn will be tomorrow again, Mr. Borrell. Thank you very much.